So before we start implementing validation, let's take a look at a brief introduction to validation on our API, because we have a couple of different options with regards to validation. Now, I mentioned before that validation is essential to implement on the server. We do not want to receive bad data from our client. We only want to receive what we define in our validation rules. And if the data doesn't meet our validation rules, then we reject the request and we send back a HTTP 400 bad request response. Now, one way we can implement validation is by using data annotations. Now, these are data attributes that we put on top of the property that we want to validate against. And in this case, it's pretty simple to implement. We just use the System Component Model Data Annotations namespace, and then we specify the attributes above the class properties that we want to validate against. And there's just a couple of simple examples in there. And this works fine, and we'll see a demonstration of implementing validation using this method. But a method that we're going to use for our application is going to be using Fluent Validation. And as our application API sends across our command to our application project, to our command handlers, then before we actually handle the logic for the command and process the request, we actually want to validate what's inside those command properties. And to do this, we'll make use of a package called Fluent Validation. And this command validator is going to sit in between our command and our command handler. And we're going to derive from the abstract validator, which we get from Fluent Validation, and pass it the command type that we're going to validate against. And then we'll be able to set rules on each individual property that's inside our command. And once again, if our data that's being sent up from our client doesn't meet our validation rules, then it gets rejected with a 400 bad request response. And just to clarify where this is happening, inside our command handlers, our validation is going to take place in between the command and the handler. There's very little point in trying to process or handle our commands if our command doesn't meet our validation requirements. So we don't even get through to the handler logic, and we simply reject the request before it gets to our handler logic. So this is what we're going to set up, and we're going to take a look at implementing this validation next.